Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You're listening to Series 2 of our special Ukraine series, dedicated to understanding how law, justice, and accountability shape the pursuit of a sustainable and just peace in Ukraine. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, we turn our attention to one of the most vital dimensions of Ukraine's resilience, the protection of human rights in the midst of Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine. Our guest, Dr. Taras Leshkovych, is a human rights officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Ukraine. Taras, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be invited.
For our audience, so they have a little bit of background on you, Taras, I'll share with them your bio. You've worked quite extensively with the focus on monitoring, documenting, and reporting human rights violations arising from Russia's war of aggression, as well as supporting Ukrainian institutions in implementing international human rights and human dignity standards. Now, with years of experience in international law and field-based human rights monitoring, Taras has been deeply involved in efforts to ensure that evidence of violations, from unlawful detentions to attacks on civilians, is collected with both rigor and integrity. His recent work also addresses the challenges of ensuring accountability and justice for victims while the war continues. Let's jump into our conversation. Taras, I want to kick off with our first question of your personal journey from law to human rights. Tell us how you became interested in this field and how you got your start.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction and for the question. I got interested in law because I was born in the family of lawyers. So both my mother and my father were lawyers. My dad was a notary and my mom was an attorney. So I grew up listening to different cases. They spoke about their work, and I grew up interested in the field. Also, back when I was still in high school, my favorite subjects were history, international relations, geography. So I was very much interested in that. Applying and entering the law school, the university, to study law was a very much logical step for me. Then when I was a student at the university, one of my favorite subjects was international law. At the time, I was a student between 2005 and 2010. So for Ukraine, international law was not a very popular career path. There was a very limited number of jobs in international law in Ukraine because it was not as relevant for us at the time. There were some limited positions in the diplomatic service. There were few international organizations present in Ukraine with very few staff. So it was not something that we as students at the time or young graduates considered as something that we could practically focus on. But I was very much interested that academically, again, because of my background, because of the fact that I love history and geography and international relations, and international law is very much encompassing elements of all of that. And then in 2014, when the annexation of Crimea happened, when the war broke out in the east of Ukraine, international law field exploded in Ukraine. Many international organizations opened or expanded their presences. A lot of projects were opened. It became very much relevant for the sad reason, but it became very much relevant for Ukraine. At that time, I was doing my PhD in international law, so I was focusing on jurisdiction of international courts and tribunals over the conflict in Ukraine, so analyzing all those cases that already back in 2015, 16, 17 were either lodged by Ukraine to different international courts or actively discussed the possibility of lodging. And then in 2017, my wife and I, we moved to Kyiv, where we started working in this area. And since 2017, I worked in many various organizations and projects related to different aspects of human rights. I worked with refugees and asylum seekers. I worked for the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine on developing and monitoring the implementation of the Human Rights Action Plan. I worked on human rights of prisoners. I worked with international organization called Geneva Call on implementation of international humanitarian law and strengthening compliance with IHL. I worked with the Council of Europe, again, on criminal justice project. And this is where I met the full-scale invasion. So I started working for the Council of Europe a couple months before the full-scale invasion. And before, we focused very much on implementation of the European human rights court's jurisprudence and standards into Ukrainian domestic system. With the start of the full-scale invasion, the government shifted very much to the investigation of war crimes to a large extent, and they needed support in that. So we provided technical support, capacity development, different trainings, programs. And a year and a half later, in July 2023, I joined the Human Rights Monitoring Mission, and this is where I am now.
Taras, I have to say, my family was a long line of engineers. Hence, I became a lawyer and my sister became a business person. But I guess in the legal community, the lawyers beget more lawyers. I'm really excited. I want to dive into since you've been engaged for so long in the arc of the atrocities that the Russians have been committing against the people of Ukraine and by extension, Europe. Walk us through the transformation from 2014 and the nature of the atrocities and the crimes from 2014 all the way through 2022, and then how that arc intensified and what patterns you've seen and what priorities for accountability stand out in your most recent reporting.
Yes, I joined the monitoring mission already after the full-scale invasion, but even before, I, of course, followed the reports. I used the reports from the monitoring mission myself in my work in different organizations, and I've been in the field, so I can speak about that, of course, too. So before the full-scale invasion and after the full-scale invasion, these are totally different scenarios. So first of all, the difference in scale is incomprehensible. What we had in 2014 was a low-intensity conflict in Crimea with very few casualties. There were still some casualties, but very few casualties. And then we had the entrenchment of Russian systems in Crimea and full annexations and replacement of Ukrainian systems and laws and institutions by the Russian systems and laws and institutions. So there were persecutions in Crimea, obviously, of Crimean Tatars, of those residents of Crimea who were perceived to be pro-Ukrainian. There was a full replacement of Ukrainian curriculum in schools. But in Crimea, there was no hostilities. The situation in the east of Ukraine was different, but still difference in scale comparing to 2022 is vast. So in Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, there were a few spikes of hostilities in 2014. There were some spikes in 2015. There were some in 2016 and 17, but otherwise it was quite low, intense armed conflict. So there were few casualties per month, maybe several people injured, but otherwise it was what we could say a frozen conflict prior to 2022. Again, in areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions that were controlled by these, we call them de facto authorities, these DPR, LPR, which Russia did not recognize as the entities that it controlled. The regime that was imposed there was also quite anti-Ukrainian and quite strict and quite violent against anyone who was perceived to be pro-Ukrainian. So there are many accounts of how people were treated, but at the same time, the situation was a bit more open to monitoring by external actors as well. So for instance, the monitoring mission at the time had field offices in Donetsk and Luhansk, had presence there. From what I remember from that time, the movement and the possibilities to monitor were restricted, but still they were present there. So we are not present in those regions in the occupied territory anymore. Regarding the types of human rights violations, so many human rights violations are the same as now as they used to be before. It's just the difference in scale is huge. At the same time, now we have something what we didn't have before. We have large-scale attacks on energy infrastructure by the Russian Federation. forced deportation of Ukrainian children, again, on a much, much bigger scale than it was prior to 2022. We have this very extensive use of FPV drones and other loitering munitions, Shahed drones. So attacks on civilian population is much bigger and much further from the front lines. 2014, 2021, only villages and civilians who lived close to the front line were affected. Now, in every corner of Ukraine, civilians might be affected from missile or drone strikes. So the situation evolved and situation deteriorated. So it became much, much worse and much, much harder to monitor because access to those territories is pretty much closed.
Taurus, how do you monitor and verify, given that the access is essentially closed? Because your office is the go-to agency for unbiased insight and monitoring and verification. How have you restructured or adapted to these challenging circumstances?
Yes, not to disclose too many details and not to endanger either our staff or our interlocutors, but we do continue devoting a portion, quite considerable portion of resources to monitoring the situation in occupied territories, precisely because, as you pointed out, we are the go-to agency and we are the primary source on what has been happening here. Every year, the UN Secretary General publishes two reports, an interim report and an annual report on the situation in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And our office is the one that largely feeds in the information on what is happening there. So we use variety of sources that are available to us. Obviously, OSINT, monitoring internet sources, monitoring news publications, court proceedings in Russia, for example, court registers to the extent that they are available. We are also talking to people who are coming from occupied territory to Ukraine. So even though the border is pretty much closed, but there is still, at the moment, one entry point that is open between Ukraine and Belarus. So Ukrainian nationals who reside in occupied territory and who need to travel or who want to flee from those areas for different reasons, they have to travel through Russia, then through Belarus, and then they can enter Ukraine. And we try to interview them and speak with them about what is the situation there. We can talk to lawyers who represent some victims. We can talk to relatives who are here but have family members there. Sometimes we can communicate online, but again, we have to be very cautious not to endanger people who reside there because that might be perceived as a threat to the occupational administration and people might get hurt if they are perceived to be in communication with us or with another human rights organization. It's not easy, but there are some possibilities to extract some pieces of information from there. Throughout the years of the full-scale invasion, we published already two thematic reports focusing on, apart from the Secretary General report. So in March 2024, we published a thematic report on the human rights situation in occupied territory, looking into 2022-2023. Then in March 2025, we published a report on children's rights in occupied territory. And I can say that we are now finalizing another report on forced displacement, reasons of forced displacement and barriers to return to those territories. So this is very much in our focus. And we are one of the few, if not only, organization that systematically and extensively reports on what has been happening there.
Taurus, I want to turn to forced displacement and the abduction of children in just a second. But a question before that is enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention. Could you tell us a little bit more? These are when people disappeared, no one knows what's happened to them, or they've been arbitrarily detained. It's Kafkaesque. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention and what mechanisms might exist or are needed to secure justice for those victims, survivors, and their families?
Yes, this is also an issue that we focus a lot of attention on. Our latest thematic report, which was published in September 2025, was focused on detention of civilians, unlawful detention of civilians in occupied territory. So exactly the arbitrary detention, the enforced disappearances. And we did over 500 interviews with victims of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, their relatives. So we collected a vast reach of information on this. The number is actually quite higher. So there are different sources. All these sources are not precise because it's impossible to provide the precise number of detained and forcibly disappeared persons because, again, no one has access to those territories. The ombudsman, the Ukrainian ombudsman, some time ago reported that there are over 1,800 ongoing civilians who are detained. The Office of the Prosecutor General, based on the number of criminal proceedings that they registered, reports over 15,000 starting from the beginning of the full-scale invasion until 2025. So these are big numbers, and in reality, they are probably even higher. What avenues for accountabilities are possible? There are few, but all of them are very much imperfect. So each case of arbitrary detention or enforced disappearance, when it becomes known by the Ukrainian law enforcement or prosecutors, a criminal case is registered and criminal investigation is conducted. The majority of these investigations and trials are in absentia because the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, they are overwhelmingly not in Ukraine, not in the custody of the law enforcement, of the Ukrainian law enforcement. So the domestic criminal system provides some form of redress, but it's a very partial form of redress. There is obviously an investigation conducted by the International Criminal Court. So far, we know that 3 arrest warrants were published against 6 individuals, so 2 focusing on forced transfer of children, and 2 arrest warrants against 4 individuals focusing on attacks on energy infrastructure. In the annual report, the ICC also published an information that they are now conducting investigation into conditions in detention. So this is more closely to arbitrary detention, but focusing again on conditions, on torture, and humane and degrading treatment. An important avenue, again, whether they will have actual trials, it's something that we cannot say at the moment. So potentially there will be some arrest warrants published, but the prospects to have anyone actually on trial in The Hague, I would say, are not high. There are also possibilities for victims to receive some form of reparations through the Register of Damages that has been established in The Hague under the Council of Europe umbrella in May 2023. It has now opened submission of claims under 14 categories, so starting from destruction or damage of homes and to loss of life, so 14 different categories, but they will open much more. They will open around 40 categories covering all types of violations. So victims of violation may submit their claims through DIA, which is this phone app that we have in Ukraine. So it's supposed to be easy, not complicated bureaucratic process. And the Register of Damages receives those claims and records them in the register. And Register of Damage is the first step or first element of the international compensation mechanism. So the second element is the International Claims Commission. The convention was adopted and signed by over 30 states in December 2025 in The Hague, and now we are waiting for 25 ratifications for this convention to enter into force. So the Claims Commission will consider those claims and will award compensation. And then the third element that should be established is the compensation fund, which will actually pay this compensation to the victims. There are also some reparation schemes that exist on domestic level. Relatively recently, end of 2024, we had a law adopted on urgent interim reparations for the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. We are now waiting for the necessary bylaws to be adopted and for this procedure to be implemented in full. So some accountability avenues do exist, but we have to understand and have to say that they are incomplete and partial. at least for now. So Russia doesn't seem to be interested in prosecuting the crimes committed by its own forces. Maybe something will change in the future, but again, I wouldn't bet too much money on that.
That's always the nature of international criminal accountability. It's difficult to ensure complete accountability, but at least there's a process for victims' catharsis and accurate historical record, and maybe actually putting some of these perpetrators in jail down the long run. Let's pivot to the question of the deportation of civilians and the kidnapping of children, because these are ongoing crimes. And the United Nations has a key role in trying to one, stop the deportation of civilians and the kidnapping of children. Is there anything that the UN can be doing or facilitating to help the return of children?
Yes, our mission is not involved in the process of returning children. Our goal is to monitor, to document violations, and as you mentioned, to create an accurate historical record. I know that other agencies are involved in that process, like UNICEF, for example, but I don't want to go into that area as I don't have inside information. I don't have detailed information about their activities. But indeed, it's one of the most well-known types of violations that is heavily discussed internationally. Violations against children, they always attract attention. And here we have kidnapping, deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia, and then giving those children to adoption into Russian families. We have the arrest warrant that was published by the International Criminal Court for that against the head of state, which is huge and something that happens quite rare. And at the same time, we know that taking children from one group to another with the specific intent can even amount to genocide. So I'm not saying that this is what has happened here, but taking children from the country that they were born in and lived and kidnapping them to another territory and then assimilating them and giving them for adoption is an atrocity, is a huge violation. Another aspect of that is that those children who still remain in the occupied territory, they are not safe either. So Russia took some children to Russia to assimilate them in Russia, but Russia also brought its own system into occupied territory and assimilates children who stayed in the occupied territory and tries to turn them into Russian citizens as well. So they replace the curriculum in schools, the language of education, the Russian version of history. They teach those children that Ukraine is a Nazi state, that we have a Nazi regime in Ukraine, that Ukrainian symbols are Nazi symbols, and so on and so forth. So we should not also forget that those children who were not kidnapped, they are also at risk and they are also endangered. Another aspect of that is the militarization of children and youth in Crimea in particular, and now in other occupied regions as well. There are some Russian organizations focused on militarization of youth, like UnArmia, for example, which is the youth army. They have organizations that teach children paramilitary education. They introduce weapons to children. They indoctrinate children so that they are willing to fight for their motherland in the future when they grow up. So yes, it's quite scary. It's quite comprehensive problem. And this is also the problem that mission monitors and documents as much as possible.
No, it really does seem that in Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine, that they have committed the entire of atrocity. You look at any previous conflict, the Russians are doing pretty much everything that's been done in every previous conflict. One area that they're particularly intensely engaged is conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Can you talk to us a little bit about the nature of the Russians' use of sexual and gender-based violence as part of their strategy, how the UN goes about documenting and doing so in a trauma-informed way, because these are obviously victims and survivors of a particularly unique crime, and special precautions need to be taken in order to collect that evidence. And then how does this fit into the broader articulation of the culpability, the accountability? We talked a little bit about, you mentioned genocide. How does this pattern of sexual gender-based violence fit into the arc of the strategy of using atrocity crimes in this conflict?
Indeed, your point that the whole array of violation has been committed is quite true. I remember when in July the European Court of Human Rights adopted its judgment in the interstate case. There was one commentator on Twitter who wrote that the court in Strasbourg found that Russia violated everything, which is correct because they found violations of each and every article that Ukraine complained of in a widespread and quite systematic way. That also includes conflict-related sexual violence, which has been widely used. After one of our reports in 2025, there was a whole series of publication in the newspapers, in the media, that based on the UN data, over 90% of Ukrainian prisoners of war were subjected to different forms of conflict-related sexual violence. So it's us. We are the organizations that gather that information and that provided that data, and that is correct. So when we talk about use of conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence in Ukraine, we can broadly speak about two main ways in which this is happening. So the first one is CRSV in detention, so against POWs, against civilian detainees, and another one, what we sometimes call the CRSV in residential areas. So when Russian forces take over a village, a city, a town, especially at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, where they took big areas of territory, they also use conflict-related sexual violence against civilians who stay there. So if we talk about CRSV in detention, so the victims are mostly men, which is something quite unique because in most armed conflicts, the majority of victims are usually women. In Ukraine, since the majority of detainees are men, the majority of CRSV victims are also men. So this includes all forms of sexual violence, beatings, electrocutions to the genitals, beatings and electrocutions while naked, threats of rape, and so on. Virtually every possible form has been recorded and documented. Obviously, when we talk to CRSV victims and survivors, we do it with the do no harm principle in our mind, with using the trauma informed methods of interviewing. We have a separate unit focusing only on conflict related sexual violence. So these are people who only document those types of violations. And always we have this goal in mind not to re-traumatize people. We only speak and interview those survivors who wish to speak with us. So we provide an opportunity to stop the interview at any moment, at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. So any moment person feels uncomfortable to continue speaking with us, they can do so without any fear or without any pressure. We also fit into the annual report on the Secretary General's representative on conflict-related sexual violence. So the section on Ukraine, the data is provided mostly by our monitoring mission.
Well, let's back up on that question of data. In today's world, there is so much digital evidence available. Some would say too much. Some would say it's not really evidence, it's more information statements. How is it that the UN is processing all this fire hose of digital information, digital evidence? And what are some of the categories that you sorted into? So for instance, when my team and I are thinking about prosecution, it's okay, is it evidence? When some of our colleagues are thinking about our journalist colleagues, look, it's just information, it's knowledge, it's an insight into what's happening. How does the UN approach both managing it, categorizing it, and what is it telling us about the nature of Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine?
Indeed, the nature of documenting human rights violation is changing because of the technical development, but we are following strictly our methodology and guidelines concerning the verification of information, the collection of information, and at the same time, we are trying to stay in line with the developments to not be left behind. For us, I would say it's a bit easier than for prosecutors because we do not find the guilt or innocence of a specific individual. We are not a criminal court. We are not the investigation. So our evidentiary standard is lower. So we do not follow the beyond the reasonable doubt. We follow the reasonable grounds to believe. So it's a bit easier for us to verify and corroborate that the violation has happened. And at the same time, for us, it is most important to establish that violation has happened. Who committed that violation? Usually the attribution that is most relevant for us is which side committed the violation, whether it was the Russians or the Ukrainian side. We rarely are looking into specific individuals who are behind those violations. So this makes it a bit easier for us. But obviously, all this vast array of information and data that is published online, we have to sort through. So we monitor all these videos that are published on social media, Telegram, other channels. Every time when we find this information, we try to corroborate that. At the same time, we still, to a large extent, focus on in-person interviews or online interviews, but with real life people. So we are recording lived experiences of those people. We are recording testimonies of those people. Again, from the point of view of evidence, testimony is not of always reliable source of information because people perceive and remember information differently. People may forget some things, but at the same time, this is a major source of information for us. We never rely on just one source of information, so we try to corroborate the fact that violation has occurred from different sources of information, or in case we see that the information fits the pattern and person is credible and reliable, then we can say that if we hear testimony from 50 individuals that torture has occurred for the POWs in this specific detention facility, that we can say that we have reasonable grounds to believe that torture is occurring in that facility. So for us, I would say that for us, this is a bit easier than for criminal investigation. So use of open source information. We also talk to other human rights organizations, NGOs, who conduct their own monitoring and their own investigation. So we try to coordinate and see whether there are any gaps in our monitoring and documenting. But indeed, the increase in the volume of information available sometimes makes it much harder to sort through and to find what is correct or not, especially with the developments of AI-generated videos. I think our work will become even harder.
Well, that last point about AI generated videos is going to make things exceptionally difficult across the board for prosecution, et cetera. Let's dive in a little bit to, as my penultimate question, the role of Ukrainian institutions, and it's a two-part question. The Ukrainian institutions have been, in my view, and PLPG's view, quite intent on protecting human rights of prisoners of war in deoccupied territories. PLPG has done some extensive training with the JAG Corps in Ukraine on the laws of war, and the Ukrainians have been very specific in abiding by the laws of war. But can you provide a little more insight into that? And then also how the Ukrainian institutions are collaborating with the United Nations. There's a lot of documentation collection. There's a lot of advocacy. There's a lot of thinking about how to shape the aggression tribunal and how to ensure fair prosecutions domestically. Just shed a little bit of light. I know it's not your sandbox, but shed a little bit of light on your Ukrainian colleagues in the domestic organizations.
Of course, in general, I would say that we have quite good and extensive collaboration with the Ukrainian governmental institutions. To begin with, the mission was invited to Ukraine by the Ukrainian government. So it was the initiative of the government back in March 2014. So we are the organization that continuously monitors the situation in Ukraine since, I believe, April 2014. The request came in March, and already starting from April, the mission was deployed and started monitoring situation. So our mandate is continuously extended. Government seems to be, I don't know if happy, but willing to have us in Ukraine and to monitor, because we monitor not only the violations committed by the Russian side, but also violations committed by Ukrainian state agents, law enforcement, so on. So it would be false to say that no violations are committed by Ukraine. Ukraine, like any state, commits some violations, but the magnitude is incomparable. So we enjoy quite good collaboration with many institutions across the board, starting from the prosecutors and ending with ministries working on specific issues. So apart from monitoring, we also provide some advice and some advocacy. We are members of some working groups under a Ministry of Justice, for example, Ministry of Development of Territories and Communities, that are working on drafting some pieces of legislation, some policies. So we are invited to contribute because we have expertise on international human rights standards. In addition to very good collaboration with the government institutions, we also work closely with the civil society in Ukraine. And civil society in Ukraine is very strong and resilient and vibrant. We have a lot of professional organizations in all areas of human rights, and our work with them only enriches our documentation and our monitoring. The government grants us access to detention facilities, to POW camps. In general, I would say it is quite open and willing to be monitored by an external UN agencies. So yeah, overall, I think it might be, for some people who used to work in different contexts, that might be quite strange that the state is also eager to investigate war crimes, that the state is eager to document human rights violations, but probably also because of the nature of the conflict, where we have an international conflict, an interstate war, where Ukrainian state is clearly the victim that defends itself. Probably that also contributes to the fact that the government is willing to collaborate with us and is willing to prosecute conflict-related crimes, not only war crimes, but other types of crimes as well, and is willing to also work on reparations for human rights violations.
Taras, you've been very generous with your time. So I just want to impose upon you to ask you one final question. And this is your closing reflection of, if you could leave our listeners with one message about what defending human rights in wartime in Ukraine truly mean, what would that one message, that one lesson be?
I would say that this is a continuous process. Sometimes it's a struggle, but it's a continuous process. It's a continuous process. It's a continuous effort that requires a lot of work. But at the same time, for me, and I believe for my colleagues, because we have quite a big mission and all mission members contribute to the work that we are doing, as well as people who work in other projects and other organizations on human rights. I think we all feel this internal gratitude and sense of moral reward because we are doing the right thing. We are contributing to something bigger. We are contributing to establishing a historical record. We are contributing to fighting impunity. We are contributing to restoring justice. And it feels good to be on the right side of history, so to say. It's not always easy. It's extremely tiresome, but at the same time, this is a very rewarding job. And I don't think there is better job for international and human rights lawyers in Ukraine than this. And I don't mean the human rights monitoring mission as such, but the field, broadly speaking. So to be an international lawyer and not to work on some aspect of human rights or international law related to the war, I think is a waste of education and resources and waste of time. So I think that this is the time to work on human rights and on international law in Ukraine. And I think that this is something that in the future we will proudly be able to tell our children and grandchildren that, well, we contributed to that. So that would be my final message to the listener.
Taras, I find it encouraging that my program on human rights, lawyering peace at the university is always oversubscribed. The next generation of international lawyers have heard your words and will continue to hear your words about this is how you utilize your law degree, and in particular your specialization in international law, in one way or another impacting human rights. So, Taurus, I really want to thank you for the incredible work that you and your colleagues do, and for taking time out of your jam-packed schedule to have this conversation with us, to share your perspective on what it takes to defend human rights and dignity, even in the darkest of times. You've done incredible work. There's incredible work ahead of you. It is making an impact, letting the world know the consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine, and the way in which they're utilizing atrocity crimes to accomplish their strategic objectives. For our members, our listeners, this has been another episode of Lawyering Peace, part of our Ukraine series. I'm Dr. Paul Williams, and until next time, thank you, Taurus.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting me. And thank you for giving voices to many other Ukrainian speakers as well.